Welcome to The Shallow End. I'm Dave Schwartz, and I'm going to get right to the point today because you're busy, we're all busy, and I want to talk about something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is how I decide which hobby podcast to listen to, why I listen to it, and which type of hobby podcast I don't listen to, and why. This is something I've periodically thought about over the years as I've drifted in and out of different types of podcasts. Some stuck with and said goodbye to others. And I also want to give some recognition to Instagram user EphysPitch for forcing me to finally get off my butt and talk about this. Over the last couple of weeks, he's been polling his IG followers about how much content they listen to, what they like, what's good, what's bad, and so forth. So please, if this is a topic that interests you and you don't yet follow EphysPitch, I recommend you do that now. Back to the topic. This is a big topic, so it's likely not the last time we'll be talking about it. And since this is the first time I've talked about it in detail, I should warn you in advance that I'm not going to reach any grand conclusions in today's episode. Instead, I'm going to be laying the groundwork for podcasting's place in not just the sports card hobby, but any hobby, because podcasting, as it's grown in popularity and function over the last 20 years, has done some pretty remarkable things for hobbyists of all interests, including sports cards. It's also going to be important to dig a border between podcasting and social media. They are not the same thing, and I will get to that. So as we get started, let me ask you something. If you listen to multiple sports card podcasts, which ones do you listen to? I realize that some of you are driving or exercising or doing who knows what as you listen to this. But if you're able to pause for a moment and think, pause this podcast and think about two things. Which sports card podcast do you listen to? And the second thing, as it relates to your hobby experience, why do you listen to those podcasts? I can still remember the first 4 sports card hobby podcasts I ever subscribed to. Sports Cards Nonsense, Cards to the Moon from 5 Card Guys, Sports Card Investor, and Confessions of a Baseball Card Addict. I started listening to podcasts in general around 2007, so it was natural for me to seek out knowledge about sports cards through podcasts as I wanted to start learning more about it. Sports Cards Nonsense is part of the Ringer network, so it wasn't hard to find it. It had a pretty strong backing through SEO and other means. It's part of a multi-million-dollar company. It popped right up when I started searching for options. Clark, who oversees Cards to the Moon, and Jeff Wilson of Sports Card Investor both understand marketing. So theirs was also easy to find. They knew how to promote themselves. Baseball Card Addict, which I'm happy to say still comes out to this day thanks to Tanner, who is at Tanman Baseball Fan on IG. It took a little more work to find. I wanted a podcast that focused specifically on baseball cards. And at the time, there were a lot more sports card podcasts than there are now. And most of those were about how to flip and make money. This was like during the boom, right? So most of those were about how to flip and make money, or they just complained about flippers making money. So after a little time spent digging, Tanner's podcast looked interesting, and it was, because years later, I'm still a subscriber. The question is, and the question I just asked you is, what was I looking for? And what was I hoping to get out of listening to them? And the answer is, I had no idea. I was just looking for information because I didn't know where to begin. Of course, 3 out of the first 4 podcasts I found, I listened to because they did the best jobs marketing themselves. I found them because they were smack dab in front of my face. Have you ever been driving around and you're starving, maybe even sugar crashing? Do you wait 6 hours until you get home and make yourself a dish like grandma cooked for you when you were a kid? Or do you pull 100 miles per hour into the closest McDonald's and order way too much food? You go to McDonald's. But here's the thing: A, your time is important, and B, human beings, for the most part, are quick learners. Sports Card Investor and Cards to the Moon were awesome sources of the most basic levels of information to help figure out what the modern sports card hobby was about. But I outgrew them very quickly and moved on. Meanwhile, both Cards to the Moon and Baseball Card Addict stayed in my feed. Why? Why do we listen to what we listen to? There's research on this that's fascinating. Most of their findings aren't shocking, but just to have some of this verified through research is helpful. It's helpful because we can apply it to our own lives, to help us cut through the noise, and to help us only give our attention to the podcast makers who deserve it, who give us, and here's the key, who give us something in return for us giving them our time and attention. In a research paper published in 2022 called Why People Listen: Motivations and Outcomes of Podcast Listening, two researchers found that two of the things that most determine whether listeners will stick around are interest-based curiosity, meaning they are interested in the general topic, and a need for cognition, which they outlined as the ability to receive knowledge and understanding. Let's put that in simpler terms. People tune into a podcast because they like the topic and can learn something about the topic. A third factor was the host. This information was discovered through surveys of podcast listeners across the world. Again, people listen to podcasts they find interesting and can learn from that are hosted by people they find reasonably likable. Have you ever stopped listening to a sports card podcast? Do you remember why you stopped listening? To put a concrete example with what we're talking about, one reason I stopped listening to sports cards nonsense is because one of the hosts, Mike, who is insanely knowledgeable about the sports card market, complained nearly every damn episode about how he just wanted to get the episode over with because he was busy and had other things to do, or he was getting annoyed by the topics, or he and the other host, Jesse, would clearly be pissed off at each other about something. There would just be this tension. So forget about it. I found my way into the hobby, discovered sports cards nonsense, learned as much as I could from them, and once the benefit of learning could no longer contend with the frustration of listening to them bicker and complain, I left. If I ever get like that, if I ever hop onto the shallow end each week, don't give you anything to think about, and spend 15 to 30 minutes complaining, I hope you give me the giant middle finger I deserve. Because remember what podcast listeners are looking for: information, understanding, usefulness, and general friendliness. If I want to listen to people fighting, I'll hang out with my kids when they're tired or hungry. Notice now one form of content we haven't talked about yet: social media. And that's deliberate, because the most fascinating thing about all of this, the big thing I noticed while reading through all this research about hobbies and content and podcasts and social media, the small nugget that freaking blew my mind was in one term that came up in research about both podcasts and social media. That term is neuroticism. Neuroticism, a clinical term used to describe intense, regular feelings of anxiety, jealousy, pessimism, loneliness, guilt, anger. In multiple studies on podcast listeners, researchers went out of their way to note that they tested their subjects for levels of neuroticism to help determine a connection between that trait and podcast consumption. And each time, They said they could find no significant connections. That's little to no connections between neuroticism and consuming podcasts. And that's not to say that there aren't podcast listeners who have their own neuroses. Of course they do. But there is no direct correlation between merely having some neuroses and consuming podcasts. But guess which content medium researchers have found drowning in neuroticism? Social media. What does this start to tell us? It starts to tell us, well, okay, let me put it this way. Have you ever gotten to the point with hobby Instagram or Twitter or any other platform where it feels like one alleged impotent scandal after another, an avalanche of FOMO, or just constant negativity? It's common, even likely, that someone will log on to hobby social media looking for a little escape from their day, but will log off feeling worse than when they logged on. That feeling is not in your imagination. It is very real. And people who dedicate their lives to studying and researching this topic, one after the next, mostly find the same connection between social media and neuroticism. But what happens when a podcast we listen to gets the same way? When it stops being helpful, stops being interesting or educational, and instead bounces from scandal to conspiracy theory, from bitterness to cackling noise? What happens then? We leave. We have the ability to leave, to say goodbye and find something better. The power that social media holds over us, we hold over the content we listen to. The power that social media holds over us, we hold that same type of power over the content we listen to. I have no advice to offer you on social media. I'm a hobby Instagram addict. I am terrified to know how many times each day I open Instagram. But podcasting and other content, you better make it worth my time, because if you don't, I'm going to leave. Podcasts exist for me, to discuss topics in thoughtful ways, to teach me something, to inform me, to make me laugh, or to just generally have fun. These are all the ways I also try to use Instagram, and sometimes I'm successful in creating a good social media experience. But sometimes I'm not. And the reason I'm not might be because I'm weak, or it might be because Instagram algorithms are more powerful than we imagine, or it might be a combination of all of that. My hope for you is that you seek out hobby content that makes your hobby experience better, and ignore hobby content that makes your experience worse. That takes a certain level of self-awareness and self-examination, and a certain level of willpower and discipline and practice and trial and error and failure and, yes, success. But it's like I said at the beginning, you're busy, I'm busy, we're all busy. We owe it to ourselves and, quite honestly, to each other to make sure we remain in control of our own hobby experiences and not the other way around. Thanks for listening to The Shallow End. I look forward to visiting again soon. Until then, take care.